Welcome again to another edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. I'm here, as always, with the world's best co-host of the Southwest Climate Podcast, Mike Crimmins.
The one and only co-host. Hi, Zach. How's it going?
Yeah, we're doing something different this time around. We are actually bringing a third person into the mix to give us his take. I'd like to introduce Paul Inya. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Zach and Mike. It's glad to be here. A longtime listener, first time participant. So I'm happy to be a third wheel with you guys this week.
No, it's so good. And I think that the listeners are like, thank God somebody else is on here finally.
Yeah, this is a good test for us because it's good to have a different voice. And Paul is a friend of the pod, somebody that we steal a lot of our material from on this podcast through the years. So we have a Slack channel that pods, Paul, you make frequent contributions here and don't even know it. And Mike rarely gives you credit for it.
I try, and I've mispronounced your name every time that we've talked about you too.
Oh, I listen, so I know when you guys steal from me. But so I just more of an introduction. I work with the National Weather Service. I'm the Science and Operations Officer in the Phoenix office. So I think a lot of times when you guys refer to me, it's Paul in Phoenix. You don't try to pronounce my last name. But as part of the National Weather Service, I'm a public employee, right? So I share the knowledge and information. So it's not really like you guys are stealing. You're borrowing from, it's a tax refund, if you will.
The only other thing that I want to do by way of introduction before getting into our conversation is just say, Paul, that you're our arch geographic enemy being based in Phoenix. And, the rivalry between Tucson and Phoenix is alive and well, even on this pod. So thank you for looking the other way and agreeing to come on. So
it's hard to overlook the Tucson-centric nature of the podcast, but I try.
Well, and for our listeners, that's exactly why we wanted you on here, because you have been elbowing us for a long time now, saying it's not the Southwest Climate Podcast, it's the Tucson Climate Podcast, and there's some truth to that. And but what we wanted to do today, Paul, is you've been in the midst of doing your Monsoon 2021. Geez, I forgot the year. Write-up. And Mike, we just can't let the 2021 monsoon die. And we just got to keep it going.
Really?
We got to keep it going. And so we wanted to get your take on that, Mike, from a lot of the stuff that you've been working on, and particularly from Central Arizona perspective, and even beyond that. But before that, I think it's worth, mainly just for me, how about that? I hopefully other people will be interested too. But you're a science and operation officer, a SOO, at the National Weather Service. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that role does.
Yeah, so each of our field offices across the country has a SOO, has a Science and Operations Officer, and we have 122 weather and forecast offices across the country. There's one down in Tucson, which is on the U of A campus, co-located there. Ours up here in Phoenix. And then there's another one up in Flagstaff. So the three offices cover Arizona. Plus the the Las Vegas office covers a little bit of Arizona as well. So there's my position all over the country. Our job, the SOO job, is to integrate new science and technology into the office and to train our staff of meteorologists. Each office has somewhere between, say, 10 and 15 operational meteorologists. So my position works to make sure that we're doing seasonal readiness training, that we're looking at new technology that's coming in. How can we better use the radar data? How can we use satellite data? Satellites had, a lot of big explosion in data availability the last few years. Those are kind of like the bread and butter things that go on in the office. Other aspects are trying to work on development and tools. So anything in-house software that we can kind of work on to make our jobs more proficient and provide better services. We integrate, work with university partners, be a liaison to the university. So working with you guys, is very much within the wheelhouse of what the SOO position might do, or collaborative research. So I've done the SOOs in Arizona actually work together fairly well, trying to work with folks at University of Arizona or Arizona State University or Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University up in Prescott. They got a pretty good meteorology program too. So we work with them in kind of the weather community that's here in Arizona. And then, like we were talking a little bit earlier too, whenever we're kind of short-staffed or people are on vacation, whatever, I pitch in. My position would backfill operational shifts as well. So even though I'm a kind of administrative management position, I very much work a lot of operations.
I guess that raised a question, and I don't want to spend too much time on the National Weather Service, but I think it's relevant to this conversation. And that is, how much would you say that there's been progress in forecasting the monsoon, or where are you guys right now on being able to make some important rainfall predictions or forecasts during the monsoon season, and how far has it come along?
I think it's interesting, a question I think that needs to, you kind of think about like what kind of time scale or aspect are you looking at? So I would say from my office, we tend to our focus is on a 7-day forecast. So anything within the next, that's our charge that we work with. So I think there's been a lot of progress, at least within what we provide in a 7-day forecast in the last 10 to 20 years. So I've worked in Arizona in the Southwest for the last 15 years. So a majority of my career has been out here. Just thinking back to like when I first started working here, 2006, trying to do any kind of forecasting during the summertime beyond like tomorrow, it was kind of a bit of a wild guess, what was going to go on. But now you look at the data, we have so much modeled data that's available to us, and there's so much more observational data, big platforms that are feeding into these weather models that they do a pretty good job of forecasting, I would say, like upswings in monsoon activity, trying to get the kind of broad strokes of like up periods versus down periods. Models do fairly good on that kind of stuff. When you start getting more focused, I think, in like the, what's going to go on today, that's improved quite a bit as well. The modeling there has improved drastically too. Down at University of Arizona, you guys have colleagues that are running WRF weather research forecast models at really high resolutions. I've been doing that for a few years now. And then the NOAA, National Weather Service, has been steadily increasing its modeling capability as well. So we get much higher resolution data, forecast data. So I think our ability to predict what's going to go on, has continuing steadily increased. I think part of the challenge in that, though, is that our partners, our customers continually expect better and better forecasts, which makes sense, right? So it's kind of evolved, just kind of, is it going to be a more active day or more active period? And it's kind of coming down more to like, is it the quintessential, is it going to rain at my house kind of a thing? And that's okay. I mean, it's just like more specific information we can provide, the better, because it starts having a lot of real impacts. Now we're looking at storm scale type of forecasting, trying to figure out how much is going to rain in very specific locations or what the potential is there, so that we look at the like flash flooding aspects, which cause so much problems and damage here during the monsoon. To back out a bit, you think about the seasonal forecasting, which I think is kind of where you guys tend to live in the podcast. I think there's still a lot of challenges in that aspect. A lot of the climate models that are run to do that kind of forecasting are still, they've obviously improved over time. All the climate and weather models improve over time, but the resolution that they tend to run on don't do as good a job resolving the features that transpire during the monsoon or lead into it that allow for the prediction of those kinds of conditions. And you're also dealing with, to an extent, basically a tropical air mass. So very subtle differences can have big ramifications. So, little changes here and there, or there's still tons of research that goes on looking at, slight temperature, sea surface temperature anomalies on like the other side of the planet, and how might they impact how the monsoon develops. So there certainly has been a lot of steady progress, but there's obviously a ton of work to go, I think, on the seasonal aspect.
Yeah, it's funny. I normally just like Slack Mike and ask Mike. He's sort of my bespoke weather forecaster, but this year I paid a lot of attention to the WRF models. And I have to say, I was actually kind of surprised at how
bad I was and how good the WRF was.
Well, I actually thought the WRF was like really good. The spatial, getting the spatial signature right is challenging, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. But maybe it was just a function of this year being, I don't know, was it a relatively easier year to forecast because it was a really active year? And would that, I guess it would also be last year was probably easy to forecast. It was just like no activity, so I don't know. I guess I was just like pleasantly surprised by paying attention.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question for Paul too, is kind of in this progression of forecasting technology and modeling and maybe it's kind of a question for the summer too, was it a little more hands off this summer? I know you were super busy because it's the impact-based forecasting that comes on then too, right? Or it's dealing with the issues of warnings and stuff like that. But have the models gotten to the point where has it made it easier for you as a forecaster to kind of focus on other things? Is it a little more hands off, or are you still kind of, is it as much work to kind of adjust the forecast, and maybe in the context of like this last summer too?
I think, Zach's question too comment about how good it looked this summer. I think, yeah, you're right. And that part of it is that there were some pretty good periods where there was distinct forcing going on. There was certain weather systems that were sparking a lot of the thunderstorm activity. So it was a little bit easier to forecast some of those aspects this summer. If it's like a little bit more typical monsoon where you just have a lot of recycled moisture underneath the monsoon high, and it's kind of like trying to figure out where the little bubbles in a boiling pot of water are going to show up there. That's a lot more difficult kind of a thing. This summer, there was a lot of instances where there was a spoon moving around in the pot. And so it was a lot easier to kind of figure out what was going to go on.
That's a great way to look at it.
It's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah.
You're welcome. And
yeah, Mike can't steal that now without attributing it to you.
I'm writing it down.
So the worst certainly did benefit from that, but there is, again, there's that steady progression because the larger scale weather models that my agency runs, you have the flagship one is the GFS, right? The global forecast system that runs 4 times a day. It predicts 15 days into the future, and it covers the entire planet. And it has a nominal resolution right now of about 13 kilometers. So that means that it can't resolve anything that's more than 26 kilometers wide, essentially. And thunderstorms are not, obviously 26 kilometers. I mean, you're talking about the size of a city at that point, essentially. So they parameterize the convection, they fake it. They put in they kind of change the physics to simulate what would happen if there's thunderstorms. Things like the WRF and then the the WRF that is being run locally there. One of the models that we use, and everyone uses now, the high resolution rapid refresh, the HER model, that's running every single hour. And these models are running more at the scale of 2 to 3 kilometers. So they don't have any parameterization. They are running at sharp enough resolution where they can let the thunderstorms happen by themselves within the model. And they do a pretty good job of figuring it out. So the WRFs or the HER model, they might not explicitly say, it's going to rain at Mike's house today, but it's not going to rain at Zach's house. But they certainly give you a very, very good indication of the flavor of the day, of like what's going to happen, what the potential is. It's really important for us as meteorologists not to take these models verbatim and say that, just the east side of Tucson is going to get storms today, or the West Valley in Phoenix is going to get storms today. We really need to kind of take them as consider the uncertainty that comes along in using these models. But there's so much of them now, and like the HER updates every single hour. So you can get, essentially a poor man's ensemble. You get a time lag ensemble just looking run after run after run of like, what is it doing? And it gives you more opportunity to think what's going to happen. And then to kind of go into like, Mike, what you were asking, I mean, it does allow us to focus more on the impact-based decision support forecasting. That is really what the agency is charged with now. Actually, the agency just changed its mission statement to include those words in there. So, 10 years ago, we might spend a lot of time forecasting during the summertime in our gridded forecast and whatnot, just on not today, but what's going to happen 4, 5, 6, 7 days from now. Now, like at least in like my office, that process is getting pretty darn automated to this point, where we are focusing a lot more on the so what of the forecast, like what does this mean and what is this going to happen, and then communicating that out. And then of course, when you get into the thick of it and the storms are actually happening, I mean, that's when you're issuing all the warnings, and it just trying to stay on top of a mesoanalysis and see how the conditions are changing to impact where and when we're issuing warnings. So that can become, that's when everything's going crazy, of course, in the office.
Yeah. And it seems like my personal opinion is we're not going to automate away the human element for some of this stuff. Like we're not going to have self-driving forecast stations, I think, like that are going to be, totally, because I think there was a thought at one point, like the models get so good, you wouldn't need anybody at this point.
I don't think so. I mean, talking even a little bit more about modeling, like one thing I was kind of watching that we had happen a few times here is that the next iteration, like the next generation of models and the warning is the whole warn on forecast system, the WAFs. And the idea behind there is that you have like super high resolution models that are running, like well under a kilometer, and that they're frequently updating, like even sometimes every 15 minutes, and they're running for just a couple of hours out into the future, like maybe 3 to 6 hours. So the idea there is that they can actually take storms that are already in existence and do a high resolution projection of like, where are they going to go? And you could actually use the model data. So the goal or the theory would be use the actual model data to issue the warnings of what's going to happen. So it's obviously going to be a lot more, I think the next reach goal for something like that is like if you have a tornadic supercell that's going to continue for 4 hours, something like that, a warn on forecast system might work, or a big bow echo moving through the plains. It'll work fine there. Around here, I think it's going to be a lot more challenging. We did have a few instances that they're running this kind of in a test right now. So the domain moves around the country every day when they're testing it out. And I got an opportunity to watch it a couple of times when it was out here in the Southwest. And it gives interesting, I think, useful information about like potential for rainfall rates from thunderstorms and things of that nature. So that kind of cues you into the flash flood potential, but it's not there yet where it's, you could be issuing flash flood warnings because this model tells you it's going to rain 3 inches 4 hours from now in this one location. It's not there yet, but that's where the science is definitely going.
That's amazing. That is amazing.
All right, Paul. So I'm curious your thoughts on this last monsoon season. I mean, Mike and I, over the course of the last 3 or 4 pods, have kind of narrated, at least from our perspective, how the monsoon unfolded and the kinds of things that we thought were interesting and unique and maybe not so unique. And I'm just curious, like, when you're running NOAA in 10 years, right? And Mike and I are still like in our pajamas, like talking on this pod to ourselves pretty much. And we're looking back on the 2021 monsoon. We're going to say certain things. What would you say about the 2021 monsoon? What do you think we're gonna be left with in 10 years?
If you do want to run the Weather Service, the job is open right now, by the way. Louis Uccellini is retiring, and if you go to usajobs.gov, you can actually find the
I think I got a shot.
Sure, why not?
I would write your letter recommendation a reference, Paul, if you want it.
I got to scratch out my next question then. Like, when the National Weather Service says a 50% chance for rain, what does that actually mean? But we'll get to it.
Oh, great. Thanks, Zach.
So the one term, like you guys have been saying a lot, is generational, right? I think you said that early on when things got going pretty quick in late June, and kind of July went nuts. And then the kind of question was, does this still kind of generational as things kind of were petering out in August? And you kind of think about maybe from a return interval perspective, I certainly think that this was a monsoon that was, the level of activity was pretty high, and you could maybe argue it's generational. Like if something that has a return interval of like 20 years, right? Or something that happens maybe every 15, 20, 25 years, that'd be generational kind of terminology. I don't think you guys were off base saying something like that. So, I mean, it was very active, from our perspective, looking at some of the data. It was not across the Southwest region. So the write-up you mentioned earlier I'm working on is kind of looking at Arizona, New Mexico, and far west Texas. It wasn't the wettest monsoon across that entire area. There were parts of Arizona that did have their wettest monsoon. Kind of is actually interesting, an area that was a little bit northeast of Phoenix up in the mountains seemed to resolve itself as being the wettest on record. So the Weather Service offices issued a record amount of different types of warnings. So a record amount of flash flood warnings. So I'm looking at that right now. This last monsoon, previous to this one, the most flash flood warnings issued was back in 2013 when 536 flash flood warnings were issued across the region. And this year we issued 884. So it was a drastic increase from that record. And you compare that to last year when we issued 110, which was the fewest on record. So,
wow.
It was obviously a very active monsoon. It wasn't, again, the wettest. I mean, there have been other ones recently which have been pretty wet, like 2014 was one that was pretty wet across the region. I think you go back to like 2006 was like the first summer I was here. That was a very active one. It was very high-end severe weather one as well. So it was certainly busy. I mean, we obviously felt it in the offices with the amount of services that we were needing to provide based on the weather activity.
So that's interesting, Mike. I'll let you chime in here, but I wanted to get this out. It's like one thing that Mike and I struggle with when we're doing this pod, but also like in the background when we're thinking about how to do this pod, is just how to like talk about all of the different variability within a regional perspective. So you were mentioning that like it was historic for some areas, if you will. Like some areas received the highest on their record. Tucson I think came in at third at the airport. And of course, there's a ton of variability just within Tucson. So, and some other places didn't receive maybe middle of the road, if you will, but characterizing the monsoon, which is a little bit of a folly, but I guess when I was listening to, I'm thinking, well, I thought I was underplaying a little bit the generational, because I agree that it's sort of like not, it's like every 20 years, like the recurrence interval, like you said, but I'd almost say that I think like if you looked at the aggregate and some metrics, that this season had to be in the top 5 for in aggregate. So if we looked at Arizona, New Mexico, or the core monsoon region, I mean, what would you say about that? Do you think that's a little bit overwrought, or would you give me that?
I don't. Looking at Mike and I talk a lot about this, like looking at the precip data and trying to figure out, which ones are the right ones to use and the rankings and stuff like that. But the NCEI gridded data for this region I'm looking at was the 22nd wettest on record. So that's not very high, to try to come out and say like this was the wettest monsoon ever, and then it's like, oh, it only ranked 22nd, and this goes back to 1895. So I mean,
and that's over what domain, spatial domain?
So that was Arizona, New Mexico, and then far like the West Texas Panhandle.
I am actually surprised at that.
Well, and I know we talked.
Well, I was going to say that the generational thing is that. I mean, I got your back on the generational, Zach, but I think that if you're a cat in Tucson, generational monsoon, like totally. Like I think if that's your lifespan, you nailed it. But then I think that the stats started to kind of, I don't know, they started to slide a little bit as the season went on. And I do think that we ran into this year the Tucson Phoenix Metroplex wet problem where it for the per capita monsoon index, I think comes into play this year in particular. I think the impact of the monsoon on people was pretty dramatic across the Southwest, but spatially it kind of fell apart it wasn't quite as wet across the Northeast part of the state. And then as you got into northern New Mexico didn't really have anything epic.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the bullseye of the rain was sort of Tucson to Phoenix area, which was, as you mentioned, at least for Arizona, it's the bulk of the population. So the precipitable water was pretty high across the South. I don't want to argue the top 5. I'll have to dig more into I am surprised though that data set only produced the 22nd wettest. But maybe I'm
with what Mike's saying though too. I mean, looking at the mapping of it, it certainly was, it was exceptionally wet for like the Phoenix area down into Tucson. Kind of like the lower desert areas was quite high. But then, like Albuquerque looks like it had a pretty ho-hum summer, like it certainly feels like that there was maybe somewhat population bias, like Mike was saying, is that because you had 6 million people that were basically like, oh my God, like this is what monsoons used to be or something like that. And it's like, sure, I mean, if that's where you live, that's fine, and that's your experience. But if you start, stepping back and kind of taking a broader view and aggregating this stuff, the story kind of becomes, it was a bit more targeted where it happened.
Yeah.
It was just like watching the monsoon even evolve across Tucson. Tucson had corners of the town had really different monsoon. I mean, you kind of evened out over time, and it was just a lot of rain everywhere. But there were points where just half of Tucson pulled ahead by a 2 or 3 inch event, and then it would go quiet, and then another part. I mean, it was that to me really that impressed upon me was some of that spatial variability and that heavy precip that really was kind of the lower desert locations. I mean, it was up by you guys, it was here in Tucson, but you didn't, I don't know, did we see those kinds of heavy precip events that were really clobbering the low deserts in some of the other parts of the state? I can't even really remember.
I don't know. I think it's a little hard to tell because I think the heaviest rain, like the mountains tend to get the frequency of the rain, right? But then, and I think, Mike, you make some of these maps, right, that look at the rainfall intensity. But the higher intensity ends up happening usually at the lower elevations because there's a lot more instability available to the thunderstorm. So, to an extent, there's going to be some proportionality between the instability of the Cape and the precip intensity, I would say. So, even in, like you're talking about though, like even in the Phoenix area, just in Phoenix being so much bigger, even too spatially, there's obviously a lot of days where, like North Scottsdale, some places are going to get 2 to 3 inches of rain, and then it doesn't even rain across the rest of the majority of the city. So I'd be kind of curious, what it's like very locally to Tucson, like how it gets covered, because here it's like it's never everyone gets rain. It's pretty rare that actually happens. So we do have the Phoenix Rainfall Index we developed a number of years ago and have that data that ran back to 1990 to try to get a sense of what was the spatial coverage of days like rains. And typically based on that, historically, we only have 1 or 2 events or days a summer where everyone gets rain. So even when the thunderstorms come in, it's pretty unusual, atypical for everyone to get rain. It's just,
Yeah, that's a really good
that's
point.
how it goes here, winners and losers, right?
And
Yep.
what did this
Yep.
year come in at? Do you recall?
As far as the amount,
Yeah, like so I mean, it's a 20-year record, so.
I got 30 years, so I do have it back to.
Oh yeah, 30 years,
1990.
1990. Sorry.
Yeah.
Math on the fly was never my strong suit.
So the metro average was 5.85 inches, so just about 6 inches. It was just eyeballing quick. Looks like it was second to 2014.
2014. Wow. I know.
2014 was when we had the record day, in Phoenix. The 3.3 inches at the airport are what is day on record, and there was parts of the metro that had 4, 5, 6 inches of rain.
Oh yeah, that was that September event with the tropical remnant or something like that, right? Norbert?
Yeah, September 8th.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
That
Totally
Norbert?
remember that. I think it was one of those. It was one of the tropical remnants. I think it was remnant or just the moisture. Yeah, I can't. I always get the names.
Yeah, it was Norbert. I'm just looking at the little write-up on our website, quick, Norbert.
I've learned not to question you when you recall, you, for some reason you have this almost photographic memory of weather events.
It's weird. And I probably am about right half the time. You just don't question me. So,
Well, yeah, because mine is not very good. So, so another thing, Paul, I'm just curious, Mike and I always try to talk about what the monsoon changed in the way that we were thinking about the monsoon, and some nuance of the monsoon that, sort of makes me learn a little bit. I don't know from your perspective, because this is, you look at this at a level of detail and through a lens that I don't, but I'm wondering if that happens to you. And if so, what might this monsoon have taught you?
I don't know. I think I've learned to always be prepared to see things that you don't think are possible. I think that's part of our challenge we always have to have with our situational awareness. And it's something I struggle with too, at times where you have to don't shut your mind to things that are going on, so be prepared for things that can happen outside what you think might be the envelope, the range of possibilities. So, I think we kind of in the office, we were geared up more towards the idea that this summer, could be busy, probably would be busier. It's hard. Last year was so dead, but last summer it was 2019 was so slow. How could this year be any worse? And then it's last year happened. And so,
are you guys mad when that happens? Were you guys mad last year? This sucks.
Myself, no. It's either way, it's going to have costs that come with it, right? So if it doesn't rain here, then we end up with our hottest summer on record, which is terrible and has its impacts. But then if you go to the flip side and you have a very busy summer and it rains all over the place and you have flooding and then you have the impacts that come from that. So, there's, it's kind of a no-win situation. There's always going to be problems that happen around here during the summertime. So, people work in our office, get into this job, obviously, because they like doing the work and they like providing the service that we provide. So, maybe on some level you want to see some kind of thunderstorm activity, and it's good to you get the rain during the summertime, obviously, and it helps knock the temperatures down and whatnot. But I don't know if everyone is chomping at the bit for it to be as, kind of wild as it was this summer, and then kind of and all the bad things that come with that as well. So,
right.
I think we just kind of watch and see, and we just roll with it, whatever comes at us, we're going to deal with it every day after day. So
it must have been exhausting. I was watching the map one day when you had all of those flash flood products or flood products more generally up at the same time. Just the handoff from one forecaster to the next must be kind of a nightmare with oh my God, all that stuff going on.
Well, and that kind of raises the question. It's what changes differently? What's different when, between 2 years ago or last year and this year?
We jump into our warning services whenever we have to. We're always ready for that. We staff differently during the summertime. If we're getting into active weather, we plan ahead. We use our own information ourselves, to try to figure out if we're expecting it to be busy. We'll line up to have more people in the office to cover those services. We're very much are thinking of looking at our day shift, do they need to come in early? Do they need to stay late? Do we need to get another person in on their day off? We need to, when it's busy, when we have these big events going on, it's not unusual for us to have, 5, 6 people in the office for us. So there's quite a workload that goes with it that, maybe not everyone would think about. Besides, we, are issuing the flash flood warnings and the severe thunderstorm warnings. There's also a lot of communication aspect that goes on. You guys see all the social media activity that gets put out. There's always media activity that comes with this activity as well. We provide other services as well, like for us in the Phoenix area, like the aviation services doing the forecast for the airports, like Sky Harbor Airport. I mean, that's very critical work that goes on there. And there's special warnings that happen with the airport whenever thunderstorms are moving close into them. So, it does require a lot of extra work on our part. So we just, we flex and we stretch and we do what we need to do to get through it.
So kind of reflecting on the monsoon again. So you wrote up several actually really nice storm summaries that are on the Phoenix weather site. So which of those was kind of the standout one? Like what was the big event for the Southwest, if not Arizona? Was it the July one or was it the subsequent?
There was
August
one 3-day event where that low came east to west.
Yeah, it was like these retrograding upper level lows seem to be like the crazy things this summer.
Yeah, I think I'm just looking at the different write-ups we did. To some aspect, I'm not very good. My memory is not very great for weather events, maybe like apparently Mike's is or something. But,
stand out.
I don't know. Yeah, I work so much weather, it all tends to just blur into this background of never-ending weather.
Never-ending 500 millibar height level map.
Yeah, which is why we have the computers. They remember it for me. So, I mean, the July event, yeah, I mean, we did have that big inverted trough upper level low that moved through from New Mexico. And, that gave us like multiple days of active severe weather. And that's just kind of a really known severe weather pattern when you get that good northeast flow coming out of northern New Mexico that just constantly is dumping storms down into the low elevation. So, I mean, that was pretty active. I mean, we had the big wind event that happened. So we're talking like, so there was a big low, when we get these northeast winds, which is something I wanted to look at a little bit more in the analysis of what was the frequency of these northeast wind events, because that's just known severe weather pattern for us. I think it's the old monsoon patterns. Mike, I think, what were those ones?
Yeah, there's like a trapping high one, and there's like the Maddox for severe weather types. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's like the Maddox 4, I think is that one where it's kind of get the high amplitude. The ridge moves quite a bit north of the four corners even. So that kind of stood out. There was the event we had where like a big, I don't know if I call it almost like a little bit of a bow echo moved across the Phoenix area and pretty much everyone got, 50 plus mile an hour winds. Then that ended up kind of laying down and causing a lot of very heavy rain, and that led into the Gila Bend flash flood incident that happened.
All right.
And just like a lot of days we had so many burn scars that my office was monitoring, when these wildfires happen earlier in the season and then they leave behind these burn scars. That's usually something we have to actively monitor for like 3 to 4 years for enhanced flash flood potential. And we had 10 in my office that we would have to watch. So not only are we looking for flash flooding that's occurring anywhere, we have to have this hyper focus on all these burn scars. So it almost takes 2 people to do the flash flood warning services, where one person is just solely watching those flash flood burn scars. And we end up issuing a lot of warnings on those burn scars. And some of them had some pretty bad flooding that happened like up into the Globe area in particular.
So I'm envisioning like a command center in the National Weather Service offices with like 15 screens. Is that how it works?
Have you never been to a Weather Service office?
I haven't. Actually, I've
really?
been the FEMA one. Remember the FEMA one? That's what I have. I have, right next door, but I've actually never seen an active, in the monsoon, if there's sort of like a command center set up. I don't know. I'm envisioning things differently. But
the offices they're set up like, EOCs, like emergency operations centers. So in my office, in most offices now we have like what's called a situational awareness display, a SAD. On my office, we have 12 flat screen TVs up on the wall, and they show all sorts of different things so that we can try to keep tabs on everything that's going on. And then we have all the workstations in the ops area that the forecasters would work at. And those ops area, we have 6 workstations that are in there, plus a few others that are scattered about through the office. So, I mean, if things are like really busy, we could certainly have 8 to 10 people working in the office.
Wow.
So one of those TVs always has something fun on it. So like what do you get to control that one TV?
I mean, we control the weather information that goes on them. Of course, there's out of the 12, 4 of them we use for local news broadcasts or just watching the local over the air kind of stuff, because it can be really handy, if there's like a dust storm that's rolling in and we're watching it and trying to figure out what's going on. these guys will send their news choppers up and put eyes on it. It's like, we use that information just as much as anyone else looking at it and just kind of in awe. We're using it to actually figure out, what's the expansive coverage and how bad might this dust storm be.
Totally. I think I was in a weather service office once though, and I noticed it was like, because I get it, you guys have to have all the network TV. It was like Days of Our Lives was on. It was like all this technical information, like Days of Our Lives was on in one corner because it had a scroll on the bottom of it, but it was kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, it might be Press Your Luck or something now. I don't know what it was on daytime TV.
Yeah, it's actually pretty good. I do like the Wayne Brady new version of
Let's Make a Deal.
Let's Make a Deal. Yep. That one's always good.
So Paul, we want to be conscious of your time here. We could talk a long time about this. We should do this again. But you mentioned before you guys were sort of thinking as you were coming into this season that you're expecting it to be a little bit busy, and probably that was in part because last year was so dead. So it's like, what's the chances 2 years in a row? But like, any thoughts on? I mean, you just everything's in play next year, or like, I mean, that's a stupid.
You're asking for a
forecast.
2022 outlook already?
Yeah, I am. We'll cut this part.
Let me hold on. I'm gonna go to the source so I can toe the company line. Let's it's equally likely that next summer will be wet or dry.
I love that response. You're actually asking about next year. No, it's funny because like this is another thing that we don't struggle with, that we sort of have like these internal conversations a lot, because prior to the season, I mean, that's the thing that everybody wants to know. It's like, well, what's the monsoon going to be like? And it's like some folks will put out some expectations, slightly tilting the odds one way or the other based on some nuance in the land surface or the atmosphere somewhere in the globe. But like, there's no real good indications. I'm sure you hold that perspective too. And obviously from the weather service, you take it one day at a time.
Yeah, I mean, there's the outlooks that the Climate Prediction Center puts out. I mean, that's what we, obviously use and we speak to. There's, the predictability, as we talked about earlier during the summertime, I think is still pretty challenging, and to what utility I think some of those are used, I would also, openly ask, because, we're always working with a lot of different partners, a lot of emergency management partners and whatnot. And it just, the outlooks from like perhaps a listener of the podcast, like, it maybe gives you some heads up of like what the summer might be like, some anticipation. But I mean, even myself, like, I'm not going to go buy enhanced homeowners insurance for the summer or something like that. I mean, it's just, the summer kind of comes and goes, and it's not a problem until it is for you. Like, I mean, until you're in the situation where there's too much rain where you're at, and now you're dealing with flooding, or you're driving someplace and there's flash flooding conditions. Or, I mean, honestly, the way more deadlier aspect that we haven't even touched on, but is the heat aspect of the summertime. I mean, everyone gets really excited and worked up on the thunderstorm activity and the precipitation, which, is important. But the heat every summer kills 2 orders of magnitude more people in Arizona than lightning or flash flooding pretty much ever could. So, wow. I mean, last year was a record number of heat-related deaths. There was over 500 heat-related deaths in Arizona. This summer, despite it being, notably cooler than last summer, last year was our record hottest summer. Despite it being notably cooler this summer, you're still having hundreds of deaths that are happening. And Maricopa County is pretty much on pace this summer as they were with last summer. And there's a lot of factors that go into that when you start looking at who's being impacted by the heat. But it's just, it takes a much bigger toll in our communities, I think, than the thunderstorm aspect of the summer.
That's a really important point to accentuate. And we do focus on the rain more than the temperature side of things.
Well, you pointed out, I'm sorry, Zach, you pointed out too, we were talking on Slack, is that we were kind of kicking this idea around too, is looking at, we can look at the top 3, wettest summers or something like that. Like those past summers of, in the 60s and the 50s, they were so much cooler than this particular summer. And you kind of pointed it out. I mean, like I'm looking at the climate at a glance here from NCEI. And so July through September, and that's excluding the heat of June too. It was the 11th warmest 3-month period on record. So it's got that trend right in there.
Yeah. And so your point though, Mike, is that had this kind of a summer, because there is a correlation between rainfall and temperature.
Yeah.
When like last year, it was, what did you say, Paul? It was record hot, or it was a really hot year because there was no rain, right? The rain brings obviously evaporative cooling and clouds and whatnot. So there is that correlation. And
yeah, I mean, last summer with, basically the failure of the rain to show up, then we just sat under the sun and baked for the summer. And that's not as surprising when you don't have the cloud cover, when you don't have the rainfall to help cool things. And then you throw in the climate change signal. I mean, that, easily gets us our hottest summer on record. But even this summer, with all the rain that parts of Arizona got, the temperatures were barely below average. And that's even with using the newer 1991 to 2020 normals, which are, much higher than temperatures were even half a century ago. So, I mean, the climate temperature wise has absolutely shifted, and you just see it. I mean, it's so stark how much hotter it's gotten here during the summertime. And it's really, it's unfortunate to see that even again, with all that rain, all that cloud cover, you still can barely cool the temperature down during the summertime. So, I mean, the impacts from the heat are significant, and that's not going to change. I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of work to try to mitigate those impacts, but that's, an unfortunate aspect of the climate here is that they're just going to keep getting worse, and especially as you get more and more people moving here.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. That was the point that I wanted to make. Like, had this season happened 50 years ago, it would have been not as hot as it was. And that's the climate, the trend that we're seeing here is been pretty persistent. And yeah, we've got
the climate's changed so much. I mean, we just can't get the cooler temperatures that we got, half a century ago. I mean, on any particular day, sure, you can get a real intense thunderstorm that maybe pushes the temperature down in some areas into like the 70s, and a ASOS or a weather sensor picks that up, and it's the coldest July day on record or something like that. Like that can happen still, those kind of real extreme outlier kind of one day events. But when it starts looking at multiple days and weeks and months and seasons, it's just shifted way too much now.
All right, Paul, anything that you wanted to cover that we didn't get a chance to talk about? We could do this again, maybe not for the monsoon, but certainly can do a winter sort of Paul conversation later. But anything else that you want to talk about before?
He's got to come in and just represent Phoenix. Every once in a while, you got to drop in and say, "You guys,
what's up?
Come on."
The Southwest extends beyond those mountains you guys see out your backyard.
It's true. Our poor Albuquerque listeners too. Like,
but maybe we'll do a Southwest Roundup where we bring in what's going on up in Albuquerque. So tell us a little bit about where we can find. So you're doing a write-up, Monsoon Recap 2021. It's going to be filled with really cool graphics and whatnot. Where do people go to get that?
So if they're patient and wait probably a few more weeks, so there's still a lot of data to parse through, and still kind of trying to figure out, trying to answer a little bit of the why this summer played out the way it did. So a little bit of attribution. Hopefully, we'd like to get that out here probably by mid-November, and that would be up on our website. People could find that weather.gov/Phoenix. Or if people follow us on our social media channels, we'll put it out there at some point too. But the website would probably be the best place to find that stuff. And the previous write-ups that you were mentioning, a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, a lot of good resources there. Awesome, Paul. That was great catching up. And thanks so much for your time here and your insight and all the background work that you do to help us out, even though you didn't know that you were doing it.
Of course. Are you guys going to, is there going to be a part 2 to the podcast? Are you going to talk IMSO? Or are you recycling from 10 years ago?
I think we're going to.
You'll know, but it'll probably, well, maybe you won't. I mean, yeah, you got to go back and listen to every single one of them though.